Bremerton, Washington, the largest naval repair complex on the West Coast. In July 2026, the Navy announced an accelerated timeline for a second carrier-capable dry dock at a Pacific Coast facility. The official statement used the word maintenance. The Pentagon budget line used the phrase surge capacity. Neither phrase tells you what this actually is. This is not a maintenance story. This is a war planning story. And the location of the second dock, once you lay it against a map of PLA Rocket Force range fans, tells you exactly which war the Pentagon is planning for and how long they expect it to last. Retention checkpoint, all 30 hook resolution T's. Here is the question the second dry dock raises, and what this video will answer. Why now? Why the West Coast? And why does the site selection only make geometric sense if the primary threat vector is trans-Pacific? The answer is not in the Navy's press release. It is in the arithmetic the Pentagon ran on a Taiwan contingency. That arithmetic leads somewhere most analysts have been reluctant to say out loud. The United States is preparing for a Pacific war that lasts longer than 90 days, and for the possibility that carriers come home with battle damage. The second dock is the physical result of that conclusion. Once you understand the geometry, the location stops looking like a logistics upgrade. It starts looking like a doctrine shift written in steel and concrete. Stay with this. The map is about to change how you read every Navy headline for the next decade. The story behind that decision begins not in 2026 but in 2019, when the Congressional Budget Office produced a classified assessment of Pacific carrier sustainment under contested conditions. Portions of that assessment have since been referenced in public testimony. The core finding, summarized in open sources, was stark. Under a high-intensity Pacific scenario, the United States had one facility capable of handling battle-damaged Nimitz-class or Ford-class carriers on the West Coast. One facility, one dry dock complex rated for nuclear-powered carriers of that displacement. And that facility sits in Bremerton, Washington, which is inside the unrefueled range of China's DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile. That is not an abstraction. The DF-26 has a publicly assessed range of approximately 4,000 kilometers in its land attack variant. Bremerton, measured from the Chinese coast, sits at approximately 8,600 kilometers. At maximum range, the DF-26 does not reach Bremerton, but that calculation assumes a static launch point. A DF-26 launched from a forward-deployed position, from a ship, or from a mobile launcher in the Western Pacific Theater, changes the geometry. And the geometry of what a sustained Pacific campaign looks like after 90 days is exactly what the CBO assessment was modeling. The radar scope does not lie. The freedom of navigation patrol does not happen by accident. The carrier defense screen does not form around a ship that is not expected to matter. Watch the flight deck. Watch the Hawkeye. Watch the submarines running their hunt operations beneath the surface. The picture is the strategy. Biennial retention checkpoint 400. Stakes bend, fuel spec band. Here is the complication that changes the entire strategic picture. It is not about the DF-26's range against Bremerton in isolation. It is about the single point of failure problem. The United States Navy currently operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. In any given Pacific contingency, planning documents have assumed that between 2 and 4 of those carriers would be operating in the Indo-Pacific theater at any one time. A carrier strike group can sustain operations for a limited duration before requiring maintenance. If a carrier sustains battle damage, that timeline compresses dramatically. It needs a dry dock rated for its displacement, capable of nuclear work, with the tooling and workforce to execute repairs under wartime conditions. On the West Coast, as of the day this decision was announced, there was effectively one such facility. What happens to your operational tempo if that facility goes offline for any reason? Damage, sabotage, workforce attrition, or the political decision to keep it out of range during an active conflict. You have carriers that cannot be repaired on the Pacific side of the continent. You route them to Norfolk, Virginia, or to Puget Sound's alternate sites, but neither option maintains the repair cycle fast enough to sustain carrier availability in a prolonged campaign. The Pentagon ran that math. The result was a maintenance gap that, under realistic 90-day-plus conflict assumptions, would reduce effective carrier presence in the Pacific by a significant fraction exactly when you need it most. I spent time going through the open-source material on this, the RAND analyses, the CBO references in congressional testimony, the Navy's own 30-year shipbuilding plans, and one number kept coming back. The projected shortfall in carrier repair capacity is not a peacetime concern, it is a sustained combat concern, which means the second dry dock is not a solution to a peacetime scheduling problem. It is a solution to a wartime production problem. That reframe matters, because a wartime production problem implies something that nobody in the Navy's Public Affairs Office said directly. The United States is explicitly planning for the possibility that this conflict does not end in 90 days. Now here is the part the map does not show yet. The site selection for the second dock is where the doctrine shift becomes legible. The Navy considered multiple options. The West Coast constraint is not absolute, at least not for conventional carriers. But for nuclear-powered carriers, the list of facilities with the necessary infrastructure, the nuclear-qualified workforce, the displacement capacity, and the security envelope narrows very quickly. When you overlay those candidate sites against PLA Rocket Force range fans, something becomes clear that the official statements have not said directly. The geometry of the selected sites only makes sense if the primary threat vector being planned against is trans-Pacific, not Atlantic. An Atlantic threat scenario would push repair capacity toward the East Coast. A peer competitor Pacific scenario pushes it toward the West Coast, but specifically toward sites that sit outside the realistic engagement envelope of even extended-range Chinese systems under the most aggressive forward deployment assumptions. San Diego Naval Base, Bremerton. Candidate sites further south or in the interior of the Pacific Coast Infrastructure Network. Each sits at a different distance from various Chinese missile systems under various deployment assumptions. The Pentagon's site selection, read against those range fans, tells you which threat envelope they were actually designing against. Retention checkpoint. 50% mid-roll hook and skier. Here is the central question again, because this is where the analysis turns. Who is the second dry dock actually for? The official answer: the Navy's carrier fleet. The real answer is more specific. It is for a carrier that has taken damage in a Taiwan contingency and needs to be repaired fast enough to return to the fight before the campaign reaches a decision point. That is a sentence the Navy will not say in a press release. But it is the only sentence that explains why this is happening now, at this cost, on this timeline. The timeline is the tell. Dry dock construction of this scale takes years under normal acquisition timelines. The accelerated schedule announced in July 2026 implies the decision to proceed was made well before the announcement. The site selection had already been resolved, and somebody in the building decided the single point of failure risk was no longer an acceptable planning assumption. That is a significant institutional shift. It means the risk calculus on a Pacific contingency changed. It changed because the assessment of how long such a contingency might last changed. Here's the take that will probably generate disagreement. The Navy's move to accelerate this dock is, in effect, an admission that the 90-day war model for a Taiwan contingency is no longer the primary planning scenario. It has been replaced by a sustained campaign model, and a sustained campaign model for a Taiwan contingency is a fundamentally different strategic posture than anything the public has been told the United States is planning for. Most people assume Taiwan contingency planning centers on a fast, decisive intervention, a carrier-heavy response that either deters PLA action or defeats it quickly before escalation dynamics make the conflict unmanageable. The evidence from the shipyard tells a different story. The evidence says the Pentagon is hedging against a war that does not end quickly, a war where carriers come home damaged, get repaired, and go back out. That is a multi-year conflict model. That is a different kind of commitment. What do you think? Does building repair capacity for a sustained Pacific campaign make deterrence more credible, or does it signal to Beijing that Washington has already accepted the possibility of prolonged conflict? Drop your answer in the comments. This is not a rhetorical question. The answer matters for how you read everything else the Navy announces in the next 24 months. Let's build the chessboard, because the geometry of the Pacific theater is what makes all of this legible. The E-2D Hawkeye banks slowly overhead, its rotodome turning, its radar painting the ocean in concentric rings. That aircraft is looking west, toward the first island chain, the arc running from Japan through the Ryukyus, through Taiwan, through the Philippines. It is also watching the space behind it, the second island chain anchored at Guam and the Marianas, the operating envelope from which American carriers and submarines have always projected power into the Western Pacific. The contested water between those two chains fills the Hawkeye's scope. The inner boundary of that scope is Beijing's objective. The strait is water, and water is crossable, but the Ohio-class submarine cruising silently beneath the Pacific horizon exists precisely because crossing it costs something. A narco-submarine can slip through undetected, an amphibious fleet cannot. The sonar dome sweeping the ocean floor, the MH-60 Seahawk running its submarine hunt pattern low over the waves, the destroyer holding its position on the carrier defense screen. These are the instruments that make that 130-kilometer crossing the most expensive and dangerous transit in military planning. The carrier's role in a Taiwan contingency is not to sit in the strait. The strait is too narrow, too shallow, and too enclosed for a carrier to operate safely under contested conditions. The carrier's role is to operate from a standoff position, likely east of the Philippines or north of the first island chain, and project power into the theater through its air wing, which extends roughly 800 to 1,000 nautical miles with aerial refueling factored in. That is the operational geometry. And that geometry puts American carriers inside the engagement envelope of several Chinese missile systems, including the DF-21D and the DF-26 in their anti-ship variants. The DF-21D, the carrier killer, has a publicly assessed range of approximately 1,500 kilometers. The DF-26 anti-ship variant extends that reach. Neither system has been demonstrated in a live engagement against a maneuvering carrier with an active Aegis defense screen and a layered air defense perimeter. Whether those systems actually work as advertised against a real carrier strike group is something the PLA has not answered in practice. But the question of what happens if they do work, even partially, against one of 11 carriers in a sustained campaign, that is the question the second dry dock answers. 15 minutes in, the carrier deck is alive with motion, flight crews respotting aircraft, deck handlers in colored jerseys moving with the precision of a choreography drilled 10,000 times. This is the machine at work. Now here is the variable, the range fan analysis, almost missed. The DF-26 is a road mobile system. It does not fire from fixed sights. It fires from transporter erector launchers that can reposition. The PLA Rocket Force has invested heavily in making that system survivable by keeping it mobile. What that means for the West Coast shipyard calculation is that the threat envelope is not static. A DF-26 launched from the eastern coast of China has a different range profile than one launched from a ship or from a forward island position in the first island chain. The Pentagon site selection for the second dock had to account for a threat envelope that moves. This is the detail that stuck with me when I was working through the publicly available material on this. The site selection is not just about current DF-26 range from current Chinese territory. It is about projected Chinese capability and positioning over the lifetime of the dock, which will be decades. You are not building a dry dock for 2026. You are building it for 2035, 2040, maybe 2050, and the PLA's force development trajectory over that period, read against publicly available Chinese defense white papers and Western assessments, points toward extended-range strike systems, sea-based mobile launch platforms, and forward positioning in the first island chain and potentially the second. The geometry of the site selection, read against that projection, tells you what the Pentagon assessed the Chinese military will look like in 15 years. That is a more interesting intelligence product than anything in the Navy's official announcement. Here is what this tells us about the current strategic moment. The shift from the 90-day model to the sustained campaign model is larger than a shipyard decision. It is the institutionalization of a new assumption about the character of a potential Pacific War. The post-Cold War era of rapid, decisive operations, the Gulf War model, the assumption that American technological superiority would produce swift outcomes, those assumptions are being quietly retired in the Pacific planning context. The second dry dock is one physical artifact of that retirement. The other artifacts are in Guam, where the United States has been investing in dispersed basing, hardened facilities, and integrated air and missile defense at a scale not seen since the Cold War. They are in the AUKUS submarine base agreements with Australia, which add a repair and sustainment node in the Southern Pacific at Darwin and Perth. They are in the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites in the Philippines, which add access nodes closer to the first island chain. Each of these moves, read individually, looks like a tactical adjustment. Read together, against the backdrop of the second dry dock decision, they are the physical infrastructure of a sustained campaign strategy. Put yourself in the position of the Chinese military planner for a moment. You have designed your A2BD architecture, the carrier killers, the anti-ship missiles, the submarine force, the island-based sensors and radars, around one assumption about American operational tempo. America will try to fight fast and win fast, because America's domestic political economy does not tolerate long wars. If the American carrier fleet can be threatened or disrupted in the first 30 to 60 days of a conflict, the political will to sustain the commitment will erode. That is the strategic theory behind the DF-21D and the DF-26. They are not just weapons. They are political instruments designed to break American resolve by threatening American power projection assets. The second dry dock challenges that theory directly. It says, assume you damage a carrier. Assume you force American naval presence back from the first island chain for a period. The carrier gets repaired. It comes back. The campaign continues. That changes the calculation. Not decisively, not alone, but it changes it. A military that knows its adversary has planned for a sustained conflict and built the infrastructure for one cannot rely on the assumption that a single dramatic blow early in the war produces political collapse. The theory of victory underlying the Chinese A2AD investment depends partly on that assumption. The second dry dock, and the broader infrastructure investment it represents, is designed to make that assumption unreliable. Retention checkpoint, engagement hook. One unresolved question. The second dry dock solves the West Coast carrier repair problem. It does not solve the workforce problem. A nuclear-qualified shipyard workforce cannot be built in months. It takes years to train the personnel who can work on the propulsion systems of a Nimitz-class or Ford-class carrier. Puget Sound Naval Shipyard has been managing workforce constraints for years, and those constraints are public record. Whether the accelerated dock timeline is matched by an accelerated workforce development program is a question that has not yet been answered in public documents. If the dock is built and the workforce is not there to use it at the capacity a sustained campaign scenario requires, the strategic value of the investment drops sharply. This is the kind of implementation gap that looks fine in a budget document and only becomes visible when you need it. Will the workforce be ready when the dock is? Comment with your read on this. Shipyard workforce capacity is one of the most undercovered stories in American naval readiness, and people who have worked in that industry tend to know things that don't show up in congressional testimony. Let's close the chessboard. Here is where the board stands as of July 2026. The United States has 11 carriers. China has 3, with more under construction. The United States has a carrier repair infrastructure being expanded specifically for sustained Pacific conflict. China does not have a comparable problem to solve, because China does not operate carriers in the same power projection role in this scenario. China's carriers are relevant, but the asymmetry of the repair and return problem runs in America's favor. The PLA's investment in carrier-killing systems is real and substantial. The DF-21D, the DF-26, the YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missile, the submarine-launched YJ-12, the Type 055 surface combatant as a strike platform, these are genuine capabilities. The question is whether they are sufficient to produce the strategic outcome Beijing needs: a rapid termination of American carrier presence in the Western Pacific before American political will can consolidate. The second dry dock is part of the American answer to that question. The answer is, we are planning for the scenario where your weapons work, at least partially, and we are building the industrial base to absorb that and continue. Retention checkpoint. Last 60 seconds. Behavior. Here is what remains unresolved. The site selection for the second dock has not been publicly finalized at the level of detail that would allow a complete range fan analysis. The choice between a Puget Sound expansion and a more southerly site further from the northern Pacific approach routes is still being negotiated between the Navy, the congressional delegations involved, and the environmental and infrastructure review processes. That ambiguity is itself informative. The fact that both options are still on the table suggests the range fan geometry is genuinely contested inside the building. There are planners who think Bremerton is fine under realistic threat assumptions, and there are planners who want additional standoff from the northern Pacific approach corridor. That internal debate has not been resolved. The second unresolved variable is the Chinese response. Beijing has watched the AUKUS announcement, the Guam buildup, the Philippine basing agreements, and now the dry dock acceleration. Each of those moves individually is explainable as routine military investment. Together, they trace the outline of a sustained campaign posture. Whether Beijing's military planners have drawn that conclusion, and whether that conclusion changes their own timeline calculus for a Taiwan contingency, is not something that appears in open sources, but it is the most consequential strategic question on the board right now. On the carrier's flight deck, F-35s sit fueled and armed in rotating alert cycles. Below decks, radar operators stare at scope screens tracking contacts across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. The tempo of those operations, sustained, expensive, continuous, answers the strategic question without a word of commentary. The United States is building the infrastructure for a long campaign, and it is building it now. The carrier does not decide a Taiwan contingency by itself. The dry dock does not decide it either. But the dry dock tells you something the carrier's presence cannot. It tells you how long America is prepared to stay, and what it is prepared to absorb and recover from. That is the message, not the hull in the water, the facility waiting for it on the coast. For China's military planners, a single dramatic strike on American naval power that forces a temporary withdrawal no longer terminates the campaign if America has the infrastructure to repair, refit, and return. The theory of political collapse through early naval victory becomes harder to sustain when the adversary has explicitly built for the long game. The board favors sustained American presence today. It will favor it more when the second dock is operational. The question is whether the workforce, the budget, and the political commitment remain consistent long enough for the dock to matter when it is needed. The carrier sailed into the Pacific. The dry dock is being built to receive it when it comes home damaged. That sentence contains more strategic information than anything the Pentagon put in its press release. On the pier, the activity is not the activity of a vessel heading into dry dock. The flight deck is not empty. The ordnance elevators are moving. The helicopter deck is receiving aircraft, not offloading them. Whatever the official language says, the picture on screen says something else.